Center focusing on advancing qualitative inquiry towards innovation, equity, diversity, and justice at the Ohio State University's College of Education and Human Ecology. Joining us today is Dr. Corey Steele from Bacone College, and his presentation today titles Exemplifying the Teaching of Our Elders, Utilizing Indigenous Methodologies in Modern Research. Before we start, we wish to acknowledge that the land of the Ohio State University is located on the traditional homeland of the Shawnee, Miami, Lenape, and Wyandotte nations, and other indigenous nations who have strong ties to this land. Today's agenda is straightforward. So we will first have some words of welcome from our director of QualLab, Dr. Penny Pasque. I will then say a few housekeeping rules for the lunch talk before Dr. Steele gives his presentation. And we will have a Q&A session at the end, so you will have opportunities to ask any questions you have. And I will close today's lunch talk by telling you how you can get involved in the QualLab this semester and next semester. So Dr. Pasque, please take it away by welcoming all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you've taken the opportunity to come either in this very moment or watching us online later after the fact. I really appreciate working with this team, with the QualLab. It's the work of the entire team and the students who have been involved since its inception, since we started in 2020. So we're pretty new, but growing very fast because of the big need and what we are as a qualitative research center, where the dean brought me in to try to help elevate qualitative research and help faculty and students and postdocs. And as we did that, we found that there was such a need greater than us. And so we know we draw from many of you around the country and across different countries around the globe. So we have grown on in social media and in our physical space. So thank you very much. We do offer a bunch of different Advanced Methods Institute, QualLab lunches, and we also have consultation hours and that's just for people in the college though, but the events are public and open. If you're interested in a consultation and aren't here, there is a fee. We can talk with you at a different time. But again, shout out to the wonderful GRAs. It is a wonderful team. And also I did want to thank our guests for the beautiful gift that adorn my ears at the moment. It's a way that I feel very close and connected to Dr. Steele, and I'm looking forward to the introduction about him and his work that's about to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pasque. So just a few more housekeeping items. Please turn off your microphone during the presentation, but please feel free to share any questions or comments using the chat space. Dr. Steele will address your questions after his presentation during the Q&A session, or you can just turn on your microphone and raise a question directly to him. I also want to draw your attention that this session is being recorded, and you will be able to access the recording on our YouTube channel after the session. Closed captioning is provided during the session, and you can enable the function at the bottom right corner of your video box. So now let's welcome our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Steele. Before he starts, I will have the honor and pleasure to introduce him. So Dr. Corey Steele is a citizen of the United Kiowa Band of Cherokee and currently serves as Vice President of Academic Affairs at Bacone College and Mellon Lecturer in the Department of Native American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Again, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Steele. The floor is yours.
Thank you all so much. And before we get started here, I'll go ahead and share my screen. But before we formally get started here, I'd like to share a story with you all. So as customary with many things that we do with my people, I want to be able to share a story with you. So the old ones tell us that a long time ago, when my people still had the ability to talk with the animals, there was a great council held. And at this time, Jistu, our rabbit, he was so excited. He was excited because he had finally been able to get a seat on the council as the council's messenger. Now with Jistu loved to talk. He loved to talk. He would talk to anyone and anybody or anything for as long as they would sit and listen. And so Jistu would talk all day, all night, and he would keep talking. Well, the day finally came where the great council was to be held, and all the animals gathered in the old council house. And Jistu took his seat amongst the council members as the council messenger. And it was his job to take what the council said and to run to all the different villages to give the council's word. Well, as Awohali, the great eagle, began the council, Jistu got so excited, he'd sit there and he'd start talking to people. He'd start talking to the person next to him. He'd start talking to the person to the other side of him. He'd start talking to the person behind him. And sooner or later, he would forget how loud he was talking. And Awohali would look at him and tell him to be quiet. And again, he'd do it again and again and again and get so loud. Finally, Awohali kicked him out of the council house, took him outside and set him on his tree stump. He said, "Sit here. When we need you, we'll come for you." Well, Jistu was kind of sad at that part, but he understood why. So as Awohali went back into the council house, he took out his rattle and he began to sing. Jistu, Jistu, adane. Jistu, Jistu, adane. Jistu, Jistu, ahani. And he got so engrossed into a song, he would sing and he would sing and he would sing and he would get louder and louder and louder. And soon all of the great council house would be able to hear him inside. Well, Awohali got upset at this. And so he sent Kanun, the bullfrog, out to deal with Jistu. Well, Kanun hopped outside, and when he got in front of Rabbit, he looked at Rabbit and he said, "You need to be quiet. You quit shaking your rattle. We're trying to do business." And as before Jistu could apologize, Kanun jumped up in the air and he kicked that rattle out of Jistu's hand. And he hopped back into the council house. Well, Jistu kind of felt bad when he went down, picked up his rattle, and he sat back on his stump. And he sat and he sat and he waited. And all of a sudden, he just pulled his rattle out again and started singing again. Jistu, Jistu, adane. Jistu, Jistu, adane. Jistu, Jistu, ahani. And again, got so loud and loud and loud that, again, disrupt the council. This time, Awohali sent Juhli the fox outside to take care of him. So Juhli the fox went out there and she took that rattle from him and she said, "Awohali told you to be quiet. What are you doing?" And this time, Juhli took the arm that he was using to shake his rattle and she tore it off. She threw it in the woods. She said, "You'll get it back later. Quit shaking your rattle and quit singing." She went back into the council house and poor little Jistu stood there with one arm looking around. But he was still excited what he was doing. So he bent it out with his other arm and grabbed that rattle. He sat there and he waited and his excitement got the better of him and he began singing again. Jistu, Jistu, ahani, Jistu, Jistu, adane. And he sang and he sang and he sang. Again, he got so loud that Awohali sent Wahia the wolf out. And when Wahia came out, Wahia looked at Jistu and he said, "Jistu, what are you doing? You keep singing, you keep shaking that rattle. You can't shake that rattle if you don't have your other arm." So Wahia took his other arm, he pulled it off and he said, "You'll get this back later." He took that rattle and he took his other arm and he went back into the council house. Well, poor little Jistu just kind of sat there on his stump, no arms. So he got quiet and he kept listening. All of a sudden he started tapping his feet. And he started tapping his feet. He started singing. Jistu, Jistu, ahani, Jistu, Jistu, adane. And again, got louder and louder and louder and louder. Finally, Awohali looked at Yona, the bear, and he said, "Go out there and deal with him." So Yona walked out there and see, Yona remembered a long time ago when Jistu had taken its big, luscious tail and left it with just that clump of a tail that bear has today. So he had a score to settle with Rabbit. So he got out there and he said, "Rabbit, Wohale told you to be quiet. And so he grabbed Rabbit by the legs and he pulled his legs off. And he said, you'll get these back when council's over. Just sit there. So in walked Yona. And there was Rabbit just sitting on a stump, just his body and his head. And he sat there all quiet like, and he started bouncing his head back and forth. And he realized that when he would hit his head one way, his ears would hit the side of his body. If he went back the other way, his ears would hit the other side of his body, and he could make a little beat. And so he started going like this, left and right, and he had that little beat, and he started singing. G-stu, ah-ha-ne, G-stu, ah-da-ne. And he kept singing, and he kept singing, and he kept singing. Finally, Wohale himself flew down from the top of the council house and flew out and landed right on top of Rabbit. And Wohale looked at Rabbit, and he yelled, will you be quiet? If you won't be quiet, we'll make you be quiet until this council is over. Before G-stu could say anything, Wohale grabbed his talons around his head and he pulled it off. And he said, sing without your mouth now. Stay here. And as Wohale was about to walk back into the council, there was just a little pluff of fur that was all left of Rabbit. And right before he got into the council house, real faintly, he could hear behind him, G-stu, ah-da-ne, G-stu, ah-da-ne, G-stu, ah-ha-ne. And Wohale stopped and he listened, and he could keep hearing the song just faintly. And he looked down at Rabbit's head. It wasn't coming from his mouth. He looked around and he says, who's singing Rabbit's song? And he went back to that little pluff of fur that sat on that stump. And he could hear that song being sung. And he leaned down and he put his ear up against that little pluff of fur, and he realized that that song was being sung from Rabbit's heart. Rabbit's heart was still beating. With every beat, he could hear his voice singing and singing and singing. One by one, the great leaders of the Animal Council came back out, and they could hear Rabbit's song. They could hear him singing. And so one by one, they took pity on Rabbit, and they felt bad for what they did. And one by one, they put Rabbit back together. And when Rabbit was finally back together, Wohale flew out and picked up his rattle and gave it to his hand and said, Rabbit, sing your song. And so Rabbit went off to sing, G-stu, ah-da-ne, G-stu, ah-ha-ne. And that's how he became the messenger for the council. That story tells us that regardless of how big or how small we might be in this world, our voice is something that is special. That a person's voice is something that no one else can take away. That our voice is something that shares a part of our being and a part of who we are. That's what our elders tell us growing up. Now, the reason I start with that is because this whole luncheon talk, I hope you enjoyed that story, but this whole luncheon talk is around utilizing Indigenous methodologies in modern research. So before I move on to the different things, who is this large Native man talking to you on screen today? So I appreciate the introduction by QualLab, but if I could allow myself to introduce me in the way I was taught. Dr. Corey Still, Oklahoma, the Geka, Norman, Oklahoma, Janelica, Dagluistani, North in the Bacon College at the University of Oklahoma, Kadaneli Osa, Iatan, John Scosawi, the Tia, the Gun, on Sahon, Junior. My name is Dr. Corey Still. I am originally from a small tribal community in Northeast Oklahoma called Cookson, but I currently live in Norman, Oklahoma. As they said, I am the current Vice President of Academic Affairs here at Bacon College, as well as a Mellon Lecturer for the University of Oklahoma in the Department of Native Studies. I've completed my PhD in Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at the University of Oklahoma in 2019, where I focused on the experiences of Indigenous men in higher education, specifically utilizing Indigenous methodologies as my research methods and tools. And one of the reasons you see all the images here on the screen is, this is who I am. This is where I come from. These are images of my family. These are images of my mentors. These are images of my nieces, my nephews, my grandparents, my elders, my parents, my mom and dad. This is, in essence, me. And I'm so excited to be able to share space with you all here today, to be able to share story with you all here today, and to be able to kind of talk about what Indigenous methodologies are. And so as we go through today, here's just a few of our objectives. So I've already done my welcome. I'm the very large brown Indian man that's talking to you all today. But I want to kind of talk through first about what validates research methodologies. So as a lot of us know, when we talk about research, we talk about validation and what is research and what isn't research. So I want to kind of talk and start a conversation there. And as we move into really looking at what are Indigenous methodologies. Now, I'm not going to go into full detail today. There's whole classes taught on Indigenous methodologies. We're going to give the surface level information here. And then third, what are ways that we can incorporate them into modern research? And then afterwards, we'll have time for open discussion and questions. And again, as we said, I do have the chat open. So if you do have a question about anything that I'm talking about, please feel free to pop it in the chat. And if I see it, I'll address it right then while we're in the discussion, okay? All right. So how do we come to validate methodologies? So anyone who does research or conducts research knows that methodologies are a critical component of how we come to examine a phenomenon, how we come to go about the steps in the process of conducting research. So in modern research, I pose the question, what determines the validity of research methodology? So oftentimes when we talk about validation, or we talk about accepted methodologies, we're talking about methodologies that have gone through peer evaluations and reviews. A lot of the times when we talk about, what's this methodology, we think about phenomenology, or we think about quantitative methodology, or, we think about case study. These are all forms of methodologies that have been evaluated, that have been publicized, that have publications, that have been peer reviewed. And we think of these as accepted practices. But who sets those standards? What standards do methodologies have to meet to be accepted or to be proven? The reality is when we talk about Indigenous methodologies and we talk about the validation of methodologies, there's a very dichotic dialogue that occurs. For instance, a lot of times I use my own life and my own examples when I tell stories or when I give presentations like this. When we talk about methodologies, we're talking about ontologies, epistemologies, and ways that we come to know and how we use those ontologies and epistemologies to approach research. But what makes one better than the other? Where do we draw the line to say, okay, this set of people are allowed to validate methodologies, but not another set of people? And what standards are we holding those to? Because oftentimes when we talk about Indigenous methodologies, just in terms of research itself, there's been a very, very chaotic relationship that exists between research and Indigenous communities. Kovacs, who's a leading scholar in Indigenous methodologies, actually says that in a lot of Indigenous communities, research could often be times considered the most dirtiest word, because there's been a lot of what would be considered ethical and accepted practices in Western methodologies occur in Indigenous communities that have no space, no bearing, no reason of being in those spaces. But yet we consider these types of methodologies as proven, as valid. Well, how come stories aren't? a lot of times when we talk about indigenous methodologies, we're talking about methodologies that aren't necessarily seen through the same lens as Western methodologies. We're talking about epistemologies and ontologies that aren't necessarily aligned with Western viewpoints. And it shows in the academy. You know, going through my own studies in my master's program, I was trained with indigenous methodologies in my undergraduate program. So going into my master's studies, I knew I wanted to use indigenous methodologies within my thesis research, but was told by my institution at the time that, well, those methodologies aren't valid. They're not valid. They're not good enough. And so in translation, I wasn't good enough to be able to use those methodologies or to have those methodologies guide the work that I was doing with indigenous communities. So I want you to ponder that question real quickly. As an indigenous scholar, telling that indigenous scholar that how they come to view the world and how they come to know the world and know knowledge within the world is not valid when dealing with other indigenous community members. So that pulls me back to that question. How do we come to validate these methodologies then? How do we come to accept these methodologies as truth? If I had said that about case study, or if I had said that about grounded theory, or if I had said that about hermeneutic phenomenology, what would that reaction have been? There's this dichotic dialogue, and a lot of it boils down to not understanding what indigenous methodologies are. And so what are indigenous methodologies? So Vine Deloria Jr. once said that strangely, there has been very little attention paid for Indian methodologies for gathering data. And what he was referring to in this was at the end of the 1800s going into the 1900s, there was this notion across America called the vanishing Indian. It was widely accepted federal policy at the time that by the year 2000, by the turn of the 21st century, there would be no such thing as a Native American left in the United States. And so what happened is you had a slew of anthropologists, a slew of ethnographists, a slew of archaeologists going out into what we know as Indian country and gathering stories and gathering knowledge and gathering any kind of bits of data or imagery or any type of photographs, any type of stories they could, so that they would be able to capture what they deemed was the vanishing Indian. But even as they were going through this, and they were going through and taking this data and taking this information and taking these objects, never once did they really pay attention to how Native people come to know what we know and how we come to know what we know. So that's why he said, strangely, there's been very little attention paid for Indian methodologies for gathering data, because in reality, there's been a lot of research on Native communities, but there has not been a lot of research with Native communities, which is one of the key differences between indigenous methodologies and Western methodologies. One of the things that really centers indigenous methodologies is the fact that we learn from our elders how to engage with the world around us. We safeguard their teachings and use them until our time comes to pass them on to the next generation. And I use this photo here, so anyone who watches Hulu, who watches Reservations Dogs, will know where this image comes from. Because there's an episode in Reservation Dogs that talks about learning from our ancestors. And if you don't know what Reservation Dogs is, it's a Hulu, it's an FX series on Hulu that is Indigenous written, produced, directed, and starred. And it really does tell a different perspective of Native life within modern times. And within the, I remember very specifically and vividly when this particular episode aired, because this talked about learning from our ancestors. And you see one of the main characters here named Woolly Jack, who's at the center, who she's praying. She's praying for guidance. She's praying for strength. And during this actual scene, her ancestors appear behind her. Her Muskogee, her Creek ancestors appear behind her to give her strength. And to me, when I seen this imagery, this really did encapsulate what it means to be able to use, and not just use, but understand Indigenous methodologies. Because for Indigenous people, Indigenous methodologies go beyond what is written down. When we talk about Indigenous methodologies, I could literally sit here and talk for multiple hours about braiding, about story work, about drum work, about different methodologies that we could use to incorporate into research. But at the very essence of this is we talk about the transferal of knowledge. How do we come to know what we know? For Native people, that happens from our elders and our ancestors. It's not passed down in books. It's not passed down in written history. It's passed down through our stories. It's passed down through how we come to understand the world. When we look at Indigenous story work specifically, and we talk about stories being a form of research and a form of methodology, all the times we're told, oh no, that's not true. Those stories, they're myths, they're legends, there's no scientific backing behind it. But yet those stories tell us how we're supposed to act. Those stories tell us how some things, both in the physical and metaphysical world, interact with each other. They tell us about how things came to be. They tell us about how things are. And those stories are passed down from generation to generation to generation. I could sit here and tell stories from my people about how we know the world came, how certain constellations came to be. You know, I think one of the most eye-opening kind of examples of this is a story that we call the Pleiades and the Pine, what talks about 7 little boys who would go out and dance when they weren't supposed to. And they would go out and play and dance. And one night when they weren't supposed to be dancing, their parents came out to go get them, but those boys started floating up in the air. And as they floated up, they went into the air and they became a part of the star people. But that 7th boy was grabbed by his parents and they were trying to bring him back down. They were trying to bring him back down, but at the very last instant, they let go. And that little boy shot up so far that you couldn't see him anymore. And so there was those 6 stars in the sky that represent the Pleiades, that we always knew there was a 7th star behind them somewhere. Around the end of the 1900s, when we started exploring space, we looked at the Pleiades constellation, and lo and behold, if you look at the Pleiades with the human eye, there's 6 stars. But if you look beyond those 6 stars with the telescope, you find the 7th star in that constellation. Information like this is passed down from generation to generation to generation. But yet, what validates those stories as research or as methodologies or as ways of knowing? Indigenous methodologies, first and foremost, sit outside of settler colonialism. So most scholars, including Patel, talks about how Western research is kind of set in settler colonialism. When we talk about research from a Western perspective, research very much is seen as property. And the product of research, that property, is something that we need to seek to hold possession of. That is very much a root, that's very much the root and the thought, the mindset of settler colonialism. Indigenous methodology flips that. Indigenous methodology says, no, like this research, this what's being produced is not necessarily property. It's not ours to hold on to safeguard, to covet, to cite, to say, oh, this is mine. This ain't yours, get back. Indigenous methodology sits outside that idea of settler colonialism and says, no, this is communal. And by communal, Indigenous methodologies are inherently reciprocal in nature. Indigenous methodologies are designed to bring that knowledge that's created through research back to the communities that participate in the research. One of the things I was taught growing up, especially by my Indigenous mentors, were we can't do research just for the sake of doing research. Oftentimes, as researchers, we have this notion of, hey, that's a good idea. I want to learn more of that. Well, that's all well and fine. One of the first questions we have to ask ourselves, especially as Indigenous researchers who are using Indigenous methodologies, is how is this line of questioning, or how is this line of inquiry going to help the community that I'm working with? What is my intentionality behind entering this research? What is my intentionality behind stepping into this space and working with these communities? Indigenous methodologies allow us to design studies, to design those lines of inquiries that will inherently bring back knowledge into the communities that participate with us. We don't do research on Native communities, we do research with Native communities. And that's a very big difference, because oftentimes Western research methodologies say, hey, you are separate. You're outside of your sample population, you're outside of your participants. You stand separate from what you're looking at. Where Indigenous methodologies come and say, okay, no, you're not doing this research on people, you're doing this research with people or with communities, not on communities. Indigenous methodologies center Indigenous people. It creates space for supporting the process of shared Indigenous thought and knowledge. So not only are we creating this idea of reciprocity for the communities, we're creating this idea of actually supporting processes and supporting the research with what's being shared. When I do story work, I tell my storytellers, I don't call them participants, I call them storytellers, because really when I do story work, I'm really being a vessel for their voices and a vessel for their stories. I tell my storytellers and say, listen, I'm not taking your stories and reshaping them and telling them in my voice. I'm your microphone. I'm your microphone to tell your stories through this research. And what that sometimes means is going the extra step when you're doing data analysis and data validation. It doesn't necessarily mean, okay, taking it, transcribing it, making sure the transcriptions are as close to the recordings as we can. It also means giving it back to those participants and making sure that what they say is what they want to say, and giving them the opportunity to say, hey, you mentioned this, you mentioned this. Is this what you want me to be able to put in? And oftentimes they may say, well, you know what? I got so engrossed in the story that really, I shouldn't really have talked about this. So can we take this piece out? And honoring that request, centering this idea of your participants will share knowledge with you, your participants will share information with you that sometimes transcends the work that you're actually doing and can enter into boundaries and spaces that information is not supposed to leave. And so when Indigenous methodology centers Indigenous peoples, it centers that idea of sharing that Indigenous thought and knowledge and respecting that Indigenous thought and knowledge to know what we can share and what we shouldn't share. Finally, Indigenous methodologies strengthen relationality. And so this kind of goes back, it incorporates all three of the previous topics here, because again, it creates and defines relationships between the researcher, and research participants. Now, for those of us, for me, when I first started learning about Indigenous methodologies and learning Western methodologies, this was a really a culture clash in my own mind. Because on one side of my head here, I'm trained in both Western methodologies and Indigenous methodologies. So on one side of me over here, I'm told, no, as a researcher, my research is separate from who I am. And I have to keep myself, I have to bracket my own identity, bracket my own thoughts, bracket my own biases away from my research and my research participants. I other myself. I have to take myself out of this. I have to take my own thought process. I have to take my own identity out of it and be very objective to this work. Indigenous methodologies challenge that, on the other hand, because it says, again, I use myself as a prime example. I use myself in the research I currently do as a prime example. How, as an Indigenous man who has experience going through undergraduate programming, how can I take myself out of that research? How can I bracket my own perspective, my own experiences, my own stories when I'm doing research that talks about Indigenous men in higher education? Indigenous methodologies kind of goes and says, now listen, there's ways that we can go through this. There's ways that we can kind of mediate this. But in reality, there's relationships between it all. For instance, one of the methods that's often accompanied with story work is what we call sharing circles. Now, they can be the most similar version of it in Western research we would call focus groups. But again, when you talk about focus groups, you have one person who's very objective. This is this, these are the participants, this is, I'm the researcher. There's that drawn boundary of what your role is. However, with sharing circles, my role can change. Yes, my role as a researcher, but my role might also have to be a brother or an uncle or just a listening ear. I have to be able to know when to move and ebb and flow with the stories and the knowledge that's being shared with us within those sharing circles, and be able to web and flow and move and transform myself from a researcher to, again, one of those community role supports, while still making sure that I'm keeping the integrity of the research project. Oftentimes, this can be hard to kind of grasp or hard to kind of think of, because everything that we do within the realm of research is so structured, so rigid, so non-fluid, that when we inject ideas like Indigenous methodologies into what we come to consider the norm, it's considered outlandish. It's considered what's going on. No, we can't do this. That's something we just can't do. That's not valid. That's not truthful. That's not who we are as researchers. But again, one of my old mentors, the late Dr. Larry Emerson, we talked about research a lot, and he said this in one of his articles, and he would say this all the time. He said, when we talk about Indigenous research methodologies, we're talking about a new way of knowing and being that's so old that it looks new. And I think that was so kind of empowering for me, and I very specifically used his quote with this image over here. So you get to see baby Corey. Yes, this is little baby Corey right here, with my grandpa and my great grandma and my great grandfather. Because as I think about Dr. Emerson and the work that he did, and when we would talk about Indigenous methodologies and how non-Indigenous researchers, when it would not necessarily click, but when they would understand that, oh my God, this is revolutionary. This is a new way to look at how we can conduct research. This is a new way of how we can create research, and how we can go about doing research. He would just kind of laugh and chuckle, and he would say this: it's just a new way of, they say it's a new way of knowing and being it's really so old that it looks new, because this is what we've done for millennia. I remember hearing stories from both my great grandma and great grandpa growing up, them telling me stories when I was little about how things were done in this world, hearing stories from my grandpa about how things were done in this world. You know, in this one photo here, you have 3 generations of Cherokee language speakers. From my Duda to my Alisi and my other Duda. All of them sitting here, passing their knowledge, passing their stories, passing the way how we view the world from a Katuish perspective into me. And for me, I know how I view the world and how I view how I come to know things. I know that's something that goes back generations, goes back a millennia. But for those that don't understand our stories, for those that might be new to our stories, for those that might be unaccustomed to our stories, they're new. They're shiny, they're exciting. But that's okay, because now we're bringing attention to it so that we know how we can better incorporate Indigenous methodologies into modern research. So when I was thinking through how I wanted to talk about this, I didn't want to be very technical. I didn't want to say, you know, this is a how-to guide, because again, to me, this is a fluid process. I wanted to give us suggestions and provide, you know, open up discussions. So how do we incorporate these Indigenous methodologies in modern research? Well, first and foremost, we have to see value in others' knowledge. We have to be able to see value. We have to be open and willing to decolonize how we think about approaching research. We have to be willing to say, hey, there is a way that we can approach it. There's a way that we have to come to think about this. And I just seen the question, do you think non-Indigenous people should use Indigenous methodologies? I definitely think there are ways that you can incorporate it. There are definitely ways that we can incorporate, and this first answer is perfect. We have to be willing to say, hey, the way we're taught might not be the only way that we can do things. The way that's accepted may not be the only way that we can do things. We can't just dismiss them, because it's often easier to dismiss what we don't understand. Oftentimes, again, I go back to my master's thesis, which is why I fought tooth and nail, and luckily didn't have to fight that hard in my dissertation to use nothing but Indigenous research methodologies, Indigenous conceptual frameworks, and Indigenous analysis within my entire dissertation. Because I had faculty and I had researchers who understood and still understand the value in others' knowledge and didn't dismiss them. Because they were able to see that, yes, while we have these structured and defined research methods, there are other methodologies. There are other methodologies out there that can be used. We have to be open-minded. If you're unfamiliar with these methodologies, don't be scared to learn them. There are a number of resources out there that you can learn from, and they're growing robustly month by month, year by year. You know, we just had a wonderful book, Reclaiming Indigenous Research, by Heather Schotten and Dr. Heather Schotten, Dr. Robin Menthor, and I think Dr. Shar Davidson, that just came out a few years ago. That book talks about reclaiming what it means to do Indigenous research in higher education. And it gives great stories and practices of how we can include these. Well, we also have to, and so going back to the question of how can non-Indigenous people, we have to weave them into what we know. Learn about Indigenous methodologies and the varying approaches they provide and how they fit within our own positionality and work. There's one methodology centered around braiding sweetgrass that talks about the weaving of the different participants and the stories and how we can weave all these things together to look at the research and to approach the research and to examine our questions. We look at story work. You look at story work and phenomenology. They kind of go hand in hand with each other. but understanding the tenets of phenomenology and understanding the tenets of story work and how those can actually work together to help you build a stronger case, to help you jump between the different position or the different role as a researcher when you're listening to these stories. There are ways that we can weave them in and out. There are ways that we can do it. But again, we can't sit here and be scared to ask these questions. These are not methodologies that are hidden away in some communities. These are methodologies that are out there that are willing to be taught. We just have to know how to go and approach and use them in the right way. Use them in a way that is intentional. Going back to, what I talked about Indigenous methodologies are, that is intentional to your research participants, that is intentional to those communities, that is intentional in creating those relationships between you as the researcher, the research, and the research participants. Again, when using Indigenous methodologies, the critical question that you always have to ask yourself is, why do you want to study what you're studying? How is it going to be beneficial? How is it going to be beneficial to the community that you're working with? That's how we begin to incorporate them. That's how we begin to understand what Indigenous methodologies are and how we can really incorporate them into modern research. The reality is, it's not hard. It's not difficult. It's not hard like we might think it is. It's just being willing to accept and being willing to kind of learn what you don't know, which sometimes that's often the hardest thing to do. Sometimes the hardest thing for any person, especially those of us that have gone through terminal degrees, is to admit when we might not know something, or admit when, hey, I need to brush up on this. And that's okay. That's why we're here, to build community. And so again, I know we didn't have a lot of time, but I wanted to go ahead and open it up for questions or further discussions. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen here so we can see everybody. Hopefully I made sense. Hopefully I didn't put any of y'all to sleep. So we'll go ahead and open it up to questions or any further discussions or insights. Anyone? Go ahead.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for everything, basically, that you not only shared with us, but also made us reflect on. I teach as well, and even though I'm not in the science fields, I am in the humanities. I teach history, and part of my assignments is Indigenous history from certain regions. And in thinking about how to incorporate Indigenous methodologies to modern research, right? So I have several thoughts that I would like to share, but the most important one probably would be, we are operating in a context that it's, 21st century is this, Ohio State, for example, is a big research university, and we have different orientations in research. But when you think about the research in the science fields, you're facing this gigantic tradition and, priorities, right? So my question is more directed to, are we really wanting to incorporate Indigenous methodology into that kind of modern research? Because we're facing something that we first need to know how to approach it. You have given us broad ideas as to how to, and those are very useful. However, when you present a research project, you're confronted with a specific situation that puts your ideas, your perspective in front of a huge structure that it's already, driven by not only ideologies, but also specific interests. So the question is in terms of how to transition into that world, right? Because it could be discouraging. And I'm thinking for the students, for example, right? For say undergraduate and even graduate students to begin to navigate that world that we're living in, right? From this perspective or any other perspectives that we find that are needed and useful and everything. So I don't expect you to give me a how to do answer, but I think that's an important thing to talk about, because otherwise we are, talking in the abstract in a way. So I just wanted to ask you this one thing about how to navigate that space, that transitional space. And that's it. And then we can hear our questions and I'll chime in later.
No, so I thank you so much for that question. And I definitely think it's vital, just regardless if we're in humanities or social science or STEM, it's vital to be able to weave these kind of ideologies and these values into our methodologies. I work with a good friend of mine. He just started his PhD in anthropology, but he has been doing work in genomics for years. And he specializes in working with indigenous communities in genomics, because he takes those values of indigenous methodologies and incorporates them, especially that in the value of going in and making sure the work that's being done is for the benefit of the communities. And, so that's why I said it might not necessarily be taking indigenous full methodologies and putting them into the hard science, but it's taking those values, taking those understandings, because again, that's where a lot of harm has been done. I could sit here and talk to you about a lot of different cases. One of the ones that just come to mind was a tribe in the Southwest who agreed to genetic testing. One of their cultural taboos is giving up blood, giving up any type of hair, giving up any type of biological samples. But the way that the researchers came in and presented it was, this is going to help this, and this, and convince them to give of themselves like that. Well, what happened was they used that biomedical material and that biomedical data to try to disprove their land claims.
Okay.
And they held that data, even though they said, hey, we're going to use it, we're going to examine it, and then we're going to destroy it. They found it in freezers 50 years later. And so when we talk about, how do we incorporate this? Is this a place? It's so a place we need to have it, especially in STEM, because I think oftentimes that's the area that, and if there's anyone STEM on here, I apologize. You can come hunt me down later. I go to Oklahoma State University. No, I'm kidding. If you know OU, there's a big rival between OU and then our OSU. So I go to OSU now. I would definitely say there's been a lot more harm done in the STEM fields with indigenous communities than within the humanities and the social sciences. And so when we talk about, is this a place that we need to start navigating? How do we even navigate this place? I think that is a prime example. And there are people out there who are starting to do this work to say, hey, yes, we are in this hard science STEM focused area, but there are still ways that we can be intentional about how we approach our work. There are still ways that we need to be, not just how can we need to be intentional of how we're going about and collecting, especially when you talk about doing genetic work. And you're talking about doing these genetic work with indigenous populations, not just here in North America, but across the world. This is a conversation me and him have on the constant, because he's always pushed to, well, you've got 3 months to do this. He's like, no, I need 6 to 9 months, because I got to go in. It's going to take me 2 months just to build relationships with the communities that you want me to work on. And being able to actually step up and say those things. And so when we talk about how do we do that for our undergrads, our master's students, well, it starts with those of us that have those terminal degrees now and that have the ability to say no, and have the ability to say, hey, listen, we need to change how we're thinking about this so we make it a little bit easier for those that are falling behind us. I think one of the prime examples one of my mentors gave me is, that was she told me that was my job. My job wasn't to make your path perfectly clear. My job was to knock a few of the rocks out of your path. Just like her mentors before her knocked a few of the rocks out of their path. And for those of us who are in these positions of power, or in these positions to be able to stand up to the various IRB boards or various ethics boards that we have to go through for our research, to say, no, we need to be able to include and be intentional about what we're doing, so that when the time comes that we're training these new generation of scholars, that's going to be one less barrier or hurdle they're going to have to fight through. And again, it goes back to that being intentional about what we're doing, being intentional about how we're approaching these things, and creating those relationships with communities. So hopefully I didn't just go off on a complete other tangent, but.
Thank you so much.
So, okay, so there was one question that came in here. Do you know of universities and colleges that have policies about research protocols and standards set up for PIs who are planning to work with Indigenous communities and about Indigenous topics? If so, have they been helpful? So there are definitely a few universities. So anytime you do work with American Indian populations, a lot of times they're automatically a protected classification. And so that automatically, for most institutions I've worked with, they're automatically considered a protected classification. And so that automatically goes through a full review. Trust me, me and Dr. Pasquale know about this a couple of times. But one thing I will say is while institutions are beginning to do a better job of recognizing how these things can come about, one of the biggest pushes that we've seen over the last probably 15 to 20 years are actual Indigenous IRBs being produced. So for instance, if you're Navajo Nation, Cherokee Nation, Choctaw Nation, a lot of tribes and sovereign nations are producing their own IRBs. So if you want to do work within their own communities, not only do you have to go through your institutional IRB, you have to go through their tribal IRB to ensure that your methods and what you're doing is going to be beneficial to the communities. And again, I think that comes back from learning our lessons from research being considered the dirtiest word in Indigenous vocabulary because of what's happened in the past. Now, like I said, there are some great examples. Northwest Indian College, they have an IRB process that specifically works with Native people. And it is probably one of the most robust IRB applications I've definitely been through and I have worked with that centers Indigenous thought and that Indigenous intentionality. So like I said, I think, and then there are a couple, I won't name names, but there are a couple that I've been like, okay, we need to do some work. But I think there are it's becoming, we're starting to see a new trend of looking and focusing in on how these IRBs can really be helpful. Like I said, there have been a few. Northwest Indian College, for one, OU does do a fairly good job. University of Oklahoma does do a fairly good job of recognizing Indigenous methodologies and including Indigenous methodologies in research when we go through IRB process. And I think that's has a lot to do with the number of Indigenous scholars that OU has produced over the years that have had a little battle here and there. And again, we go back to moving some of those pebbles out of the road for other people. But I do believe there are a number of institutions that are working with that. But I think where the critical power and the critical development has been is those tribal IRBs. And the tribes being able to take ownership of saying, listen, if you're going to do work in our communities, you're going to get it approved through us first. We're not gonna allow you just to come in and do the work. You're gonna have to prove to us that you know what you're doing, and we know what's going to happen, and where this research and what is actually going to come to our communities. So I think that's been probably the most robust growth we've seen over the last couple of years. I know we've hit the top of the hour. So I just want to say thank you all for sharing and allowing me to share space. And I'll go ahead and turn it back over to the wonderful QualLab team.
Thank you so much, Dr. Steele, for your engagement, also for your wonderful presentation. We realized that we're reaching 1 o'clock, so thank you guys all for coming. Before we close, I just want to quickly share with you guys to have a brief recap of our QualLab launches. In the past semester, we have 4 fabulous speakers covering a wide range of topics on qualitative methodology. So if you are interested in watching any of this, you can find the recordings on our YouTube channel. Coming up in spring 2023, we have a couple more QualLab launches. So now you can, if you're interested, you can also go ahead and register for the one in February and March. So this marks the end of our launch talk today, and this is the last one we have this semester. Thank you all for joining us, and hope to see you guys again next year.